laying on the middle of the road.
Let's go to our next interview of the day. Joining me live now is Liberal Senator James Paterson. Senator, thanks for your time today. Let's begin on religious protections. In the headlines again today, what do you make from this letter from principals? They're talking about putting forward the case for religious freedom, so a separate so-called positive religious freedom to be enacted in Australia about the school ethos. Does that make it quite a broad carve-out for them?
Well, Tom, let's quickly just take a step back and ask, why are there faith-based schools and why do parents choose to send their children to faith-based schools? They choose to send them there because, for a range of reasons, but one of the driving reasons we know is because those schools promise that they will teach those children the values of their faith. They'll inculcate them in their religion and they'll raise them in that faith and they'll pass those values on from one generation to the next. So for the whole purpose of that organisation as a school to succeed, they have to be able to employ staff who are willing to teach those values to their students. Now, regardless of the sexuality or any other characteristic of those teachers, those employees, if they're not willing to teach those values, then obviously there's a problem for the school and a problem for the parents sending their kids to that school.
So when you say teach those values, I mean, if you get the example of someone who is gay and married, but a science teacher, well, they're just going to teach the kids science, right?
Well, and I think it's more interesting to think about what a contrary example might be, Tom. So someone who's heterosexual, married or unmarried, but is uncomfortable teaching the religious ethos of the school, well, then it would be entirely appropriate in the interview stage for that school for them to say, this doesn't sound like the right school for you, we've got a particular set of values and we want you to teach those values to the students. And if you're not comfortable doing that, well, then there are a lot of other schools that you'd probably be more comfortable at.
Right, so we're talking there, one example, let's try to go with something specific about the school believing in the religious faith or the church faith of marriage being between a man and a woman. Now, when they're interviewing a teacher about this, is it just the religious education teacher they're clarifying this with? What about the science teacher?
Well, I mean, all teachers have to uphold the values of the school and shouldn't be openly contradicting the values of the school to the students within the classroom time. That would obviously go against the purpose of the school. But I think it's really important to remember, Tom, I know a lot of the heat and the light in this debate is around issues of sexuality and morality, but religious schools are a lot more than just the sexuality and morality. They do have a much broader ethos, and when they're hiring teachers, they're not just interested in their views on those things, they're interested in their much more wider holistic views. And I think it would be unfortunate if this debate was perceived in that really narrow context, because although that generates controversy, it's just a very small part of what schools do.
But it seems to be the only thing that you could really pull up a school on discrimination, because if you say, well, we didn't think you were as passionate as the other teacher about instilling various ethics into our students, well, that's just a sort of subjective thing. That seems to be why we're focusing on sexuality, you know, because that's something that actually amounts to discrimination.
I can think of lots of other examples, Tom. Here's one. There are people who of no faith who do teach in religious schools, and that's okay as long as they're willing to go along with the school processes around faith. But if you were someone who had a very strong atheist conviction and you couldn't help but convey that to your students in your classes, well, then obviously that would be a problem for the school and for the parents of the students in that school. And that's a very good example of how a religious school needs a freedom to hire teachers who believe in the values of the school and want to pass those values on to students, or can do so happily.
Right. So if you've got someone who is gay, for example, a teacher, a maths teacher, and they're married to their partner, and a student asks them what their views are on marriage, what should they say?
Well, I mean, I'm not here to police what goes on in individual classrooms, Tom. That's the last thing I want to do. What I want is
what I'm trying to just establish is what could they say that would mean a school would remove them or have the right to remove them in that situation? Because this is the right we're talking about.
Well, I mean, in practice, Tom, schools are managing this already day to day. There are faith-based schools that have teachers who are gay. No doubt now, if not in previous years since the passing of same-sex marriage, they would have married gay teachers, and they're finding a way to make this work. And I think the important thing is that we allow schools to continue to be able to do that without intervening and having politicians looking into classrooms and deciding how things should be conducted.
But we're talking about politicians deciding what the school can actually do in that situation. So I'm just trying to establish, in that situation, is the teacher supposed to say, well, you know the Bible's view on that and nothing else? Are they supposed to not disclose it? What sort of response would a school be able to insist upon a teacher giving?
Well, as I said from the start, Tom, I think the most important thing is that at the schools at the hiring stage of the process are able to say to teachers, these are the values of our school. Are you comfortable with being part of a school community that has those values? Where it's relevant to your role as a teacher, are you willing to teach those values in the classroom? And I think that's a perfect point at which for any teacher who would not be comfortable with that to say so, and any school to make clear what their expectations are. And I don't imagine that this would need to go any further beyond that hiring point.
Right, but you say where it's relevant. So in this situation where it's a maths teacher but a student's obviously curious in some way, their response, if they simply say, well, look, I'm married, I mean, you can lie about it, I suppose, that's another sin. I'm married, but this is the school's view, that would be a fair enough thing to say, or this is the Bible's view?
Well, Tom, I went to a public school which is non-religious, and I don't remember asking questions like that to my maths teacher. But I imagine if I did, that my maths teacher would, encourage me to talk to the relevant teacher in the school about the relevant issue that I have, whether it's on sexuality, morality, faith, or English. They'd direct me to the appropriate person in the school who can help me with whatever query I might have.
But what schools are actually saying, religious schools, is, well, all teachers have this type of pastoral care role. So it still begs the question of what they should be doing or should be required to do in that situation.
Yeah, Tom, that's a fair question, and we're looking at the detail of this. As you pointed out, it's a complex area, and a blunt one-size-fits-all answer I don't think is going to do it. On the one hand, I think there's some problems with the way that the law is drafted at the moment, as we've clearly identified with students, and that needs to be fixed. On the other hand, getting rid of the protections for religious schools entirely, as some propose to do, the Greens certainly propose to do, would make it really difficult for people to run a faith-based school in a way that is consistent with their values, and I don't think we want to go down that path either. We do have to find a sensible balance on this, and I'm very confident that the Attorney-General Christian Porter, who is leading this process and understands the detail and the concerns of people of all persuasions on this issue, will get to a really good and positive landing on that.
Right. I guess it would be great to see the full report, but alas, me and perhaps you as well. Sure. I want to ask about the national interest test that's being introduced as well, James Paterson, for these research grants for higher education. Now, we've had ministerial intervention lately in these grants where they've basically intervened in the normal process and just said, sorry, that project's no longer going to go ahead. Should the minister be that almighty and powerful?
Well, I was in the Senate estimates hearing last week, Tom, where it was identified the range of projects that the former Education Minister, Simon Birmingham, had rejected. And I took the opportunity at the time, and I want to reiterate it now, to congratulate Simon Birmingham for his careful stewardship of taxpayer dollars. The truth is some seriously wacky grants were being proposed and agreed to be funded by a process where academics approve each other's projects and fund it with taxpayers' money. I think it's entirely appropriate for a representative of taxpayers, the elected representative of taxpayers, in this case in the Education Minister, to say, are these projects really worthy of taxpayer support? Not whether they should be conducted at all, that's a matter for researchers and universities to decide, but should special extra taxpayer dollars go behind these projects? My view is only when they demonstrate value for money for taxpayers.
Is there a bit of an issue here, though? Because, look, on the surface of it, it's hard to argue. I'm trying to just pull up the one I was talking about before. It was to do with post-Orientalist arts in the Strait of Gibraltar. Pretty niche, James Paterson. You won't get a strong defence of that. No offence to anyone out there particularly interested in that area. But we could talk about another one down the track where a government might say, you know what, let's not give this government money to this in-depth study on climate change on the Great Barrier Reef. I think that's garbage. I mean, would that be a problem?
Well, Tom, I think what Dantine is proposing, which I think is a really sensible path forward, is Yes, ultimately the buck stops with the minister, and we're dealing with the expenditure of taxpayer funds. So someone who is accountable to taxpayers and can lose their job if they make the wrong decision has to be that final decision maker. But before we get to that point, I think the ARC and academics themselves should have to, in their application process, demonstrate how is this going to be of value to Australia and Australians, how is Australian taxpayers' money going to be spent here in a way that adds value to those taxpayers. Because we have a lot of good causes, Tom, that we have to say no to, that come to us all the time and ask for money, and we wish we could say yes more often, but there's a limited amount of dollars in the federal budget. We just can't say yes to everyone. So if we are saying yes to research projects, we better make sure that it's not coming at the expense of other worthwhile things that we could be doing with that money, including, by the way, returning that money to taxpayers themselves to spend in their own best interests.
The other thing I want to get to is the embassy in Israel, a pretty pointed comment from Scott Morrison about whatever Indonesia might think. Do you think there's a bit of a threat hanging over us from Indonesia if we decide to shift the embassy?
One of the things I've found very funny in this debate, Tom, is that there's a lot of people who've often said Australia needs to have a more independent foreign policy, and by that they mean we should be less influenced by Australia. If you drew a Venn diagram, though, Tom, those exact same people are also saying, well, we shouldn't move our embassy in Israel because that might offend Indonesia. Well, you can't have it both ways. Either we have an independent foreign policy and Australia forms it according to our own values and our own interests, or we allow our foreign policy to be dictated to by others, including other governments, including friendly governments. My view is very much that we should determine first consistent with our values and consistent with our interests, and that's what the Prime Minister is doing, and I support him 100% on this.
Liberal Senator James Paterson, we speak to each fortnight. Chat soon.
Thanks.